I'm a Cancer. That's my sign. And one of the traits of a Cancer that I always read was, oh, you're a homebody. And I never felt like that applied to me because I never felt like I had a home for a long time in my life. When I was growing up, we lived in this big old house and in a small town in Indiana. And it sat right at the edge of town. And it was kind of arranged in between the lumber yard, which was behind us, where we used to play amongst the wood and the tiles and all that. And then across the street was a junkyard that was just a giant tower of junk. And then across the other street, across the railroad tracks, was the Stokely Van Camp plant where they would process tomatoes and make ketchup. So that's where I lived. I lived down at the edge of town like that. It was a great big house. But my parents didn't own it. They rented it from the man who owned the lumber yard, which was where my dad worked. And in fact, my parents never owned any house they ever lived in. It just wasn't one of those things for them. And when I got to be a certain age, probably middle school, we moved out of that house and we moved into a series of smaller apartments and houses and things like that. And they finally moved into a little house when I was in college that they lived in until they went into the nursing home. So all of those places were places that I lived, but they were never really home to me. And that continued on through college and even when I moved to Chicago. I just lived a lot of places. And then I met a woman who would end up being my wife. And we decided that we needed to have a home together. So we started looking. And for some reason, I think I got this notion in my head that because this was probably the only home I was ever going to own, it was the only thing that was ever going to be mine, that it had to be perfect, it had to be right. And we started on this journey of looking at houses. 32 houses we looked at. And every one there was an issue. One house was beautiful, but it looked out over the garbage bins of a school. And I didn't want to sit on my front porch and look at garbage. One house was in a bad neighborhood. One house was great, but when I was standing there in the middle of the day, I looked down in the yard and saw a rat run across the yard. I'm like, we're done here. Not taking this one. I just kept ticking houses off the list till we got to the last day. We had decided last day, and incidentally, the house that we live in now was literally the last house we looked at out of 32. But that day started a little bit different. We met our real estate agent, Todd, up on the north side. And we're sitting outside this house. And we're waiting. And at first we were in the car together and we're waiting for Todd. And then Todd pulled up and we got in his car. And there was something about this area that looked really familiar to me. And I'm looking at the house and we're waiting for the other real estate agent. And then I thought, I know. This is a rare moment, because seldom when you go looking for a house do you get the opportunity to look at a house that is the location of a double homicide. At least with the thought of purchasing it. And so some of you may know this story. In February 2005, on the north side of Chicago, a man broke into the basement of a home owned by federal judge Joan Lefkoe. And he waited in the basement because he wanted to kill her. But she didn't come home. Her husband and her mother came home. So he killed them instead. And for a while they thought that it was connected to a white supremacist that she had put away. And then they found out later, when the police had cornered him, that he was just a guy who she had ruled against in a case, and he got angry and he killed her, and then he killed himself in a van in Milwaukee. And they found him because he left a cigarette butt in the house and his DNA was on it. And he waited there in the basement for her, but he killed them instead. And she came home and found the bodies. And now a year later, here we were sitting outside this house. And we were waiting just to cross another showing off our list. But the house looked different. It looked different because if you remember when it happened, the house looked really old, and that's because they had ripped all the siding off of it. They were in the process of re-siding the house. So in all the photos and all the news reports, it looked kind of like an old house because they hadn't put the new siding on. And finally they did. It had new walls. It looked like a new house, but I still recognized it. Is this Judge Lefkoe's house? I said to Todd, the real estate agent. I think it might be, he said. He knew. He knew it was. And I looked at him and I'm like, I think it is. And he goes, yeah, it is. And my wife, Claire, didn't remember the story quickly, that it would be sort of unfair to our kids to be the kids on the block who were living in the murder house. So he said, well, we have to wait for the other real estate agent to show up, but I totally understand if you don't want to go in. And Claire said, thank you. And I said, oh, we're going in. I mean, how many times do you get to walk through a place where 2 people were shot dead and ask thoughtful questions like, what's the yearly heating bill? And how much light does this kitchen get? And are those blood stains in that tile grout? And then I remembered a trip I took years before to LA. And a friend of mine who knew that I had once played the lead role in a show at the Annoyance Theater called Manson the Musical took me for a ride through the Hollywood Hills one night. And we're just driving through the Hollywood Hills and it's dark and we're chatting. And then all of a sudden I said, hey, you know what I'd really love to see? I'd love to see the house where Sharon Tate used to live. And as I said that, he turned up a driveway to a gate and said, here we are. Because he knew. 10050 Cielo Drive, where Sharon Tate and 3 other people were murdered by the Manson family in 1969. And we stood at that gate and we looked down the driveway and we saw lights in the house because somebody else was living there. And I thought, how is that possible? How can you live in a place like that, knowing what had happened? And I went back to the hotel and I thought about it even more. How long do you wait? Like you paint over pig on the wall in blood and you clean up a little bit and then you put a for sale sign up and somebody buys it. And then somebody else buys it and somebody else buys it. And I thought, how is that possible? And to be fair, in 1994, they tore the house down. They tore that house down, they built a new house, and they even changed the address, which is now 10066 Cielo Drive. So there's no connection at all. I guess the novelty of living in the Manson house wore off. So I gave my wife the option to not come in, but she reluctantly agreed, and we set off into the house. And a weird thing happened, because as we walked through, I sort of got caught up. And I started ticking off the things on my list that I had done in any other house we'd ever been in. Oh, this is nice. The rooms are kind of small. I can do this with this bathroom. The woodwork, original, beautiful on the inside of the house. Great backyard. The kitchen was small, but it was cozy, and I was starting to think of ways we could expand it and make it more modern, because I love to have people over and I love to cook. And I got caught up in all those thoughts of what I could do to the place. And I thought about that until it came time to go down into the basement, which is where the murders happened. And it wasn't like a modern finished basement where it was like a family room. It was divided into bedrooms because their daughters, who were teenagers, had their bedrooms down there. And it was a tile floor. I'll never forget, it was a brown tile floor. And I had a momentary thought of, what if the daughters had been home? what would have happened? And it was during that thought that I looked down and I noticed it. There was a dark stain in the grout on the floor. It's impossible, my wife said later. They would have cleaned that up. There's no way they would have let that stay down there. And I thought, I don't know. I thought about it. And we walked upstairs and we were heading for the door, and the real estate agent said something I will never forget. After probably 30 minutes in that house with no conversation at all about where we really were, she said, I know this house has a history. A terrible thing happened here. The family is bringing in a shaman to burn sage and cleanse this house of the bad energy that might linger here. But they want to let people know that even though something bad happened, this is a place where they lived and raised a family. And it would be a shame for one horrible thing to erase all the loving memories they made here. And they hope another family gets the chance to do the same. And I was struck how hard it must be to have the same place that holds so many memories of joy hold such pain as well. And how strong you have to be to remember the good parts and let go of the bad ones that would drag you down. We didn't buy the house. It wasn't right for us. But thinking back on that day, I came to realize something. I went in thinking only about how people had died there. But I came out thinking about how people had lived there. And it's changed the way I look at my own house. Every dent in the wall, every scratch on the floor tells a story. Every piece of art, every book, everything in our house speaks to who we are as a family and how we've lived together in the house, inside those walls. A house is just a building. Its walls hold things in, good and bad, life, love, loss, lies, happiness and heartache, joy and pain. It will always be a house. But for you, it's only a home while you're in it with the people that you love. And no matter what happens, you get to decide what kind of home it is.